Welcome to the Evergreen Thumb, episode 58. My guest today is Todd Murray, and Todd is the director of WSU Puyallups Research and Extension Center, and is also the chair of the Washington Invasive Species Council. And he's here today to talk to us about how climate change could affect pest populations in our gardens. Hi, Todd. Thanks for coming back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So today you're here to talk to us about how climate change might affect pests in our gardens. So I guess just to start off with the very basics, what is a pest?
I think that's a great place to start because in my worldview on how our changes in climate is really in context of what pests are and what they're really good at. And a way to understand pests is to really understand different life strategies on this planet. And I know that that's a really big picture, place to start, but I think it's a good one to start because there are no such things as pests. Pests are a completely human interaction result, and so without humans, pests don't exist. And I know that seems a little bit abstract, but it makes more sense when you really understand the things that we consider pests, some of the traits that they carry. What a pest is really that human interaction. And a great example is like deer isn't a pest when it's kind of all cute and cuddly in the forest and looking like Bambi, but the second it comes into your strawberry patch, you want to kill it or at least like make it suffer somehow. And so you want to revenge on that animal because of that interaction. Another good example is like ladybugs, ladybird beetles are awesome to have in your garden when they're eating aphids, but when they mass up by the thousands on the side of your house and then come into your house for winter, now they're a pest. And so it really is that human interaction. And the thing that we see consistent with pests are they love disturbances and they love changes in the environment, whether it's a tree falling or a badger digging a hole and turning over some soil or something. All the things that we consider pests love that situation of a disturbance. The other thing that we see is pests generally. Life has two strategies to be successful on this planet. You can either be a really good competitor, and if you're a good competitor, often you have very few babies, but you put a lot of energy in making sure that those babies reach adulthood and can pass on the genes. The other strategy is just to flood the environment with a bunch of babies in hopes that one or two survive. And so the other trait that we see with pests are that they play the numbers game. They often just flood the environment with a bunch of babies, and it turns out with pests, especially if there's a lot of disturbance happening in the environment, a lot of them do survive and become that kind of pest interaction with people. So I think asking what a pest is a great place to start.
Yeah, the way you're explaining it, I think of it's a lot of it has to do with perspective of where the creature is and, what its actions are. If it's, like you said, eating your strawberries, you don't want it around. But if it's out in the woods and, you don't even think about it.
Yeah, yeah.
So thinking about pest activity and kind of the changing trends in temperatures that we've been seeing both in the summer and in the winter, how might those affect like the pest life cycle and when those pests are active compared to say, what's growing or what's blooming and how they interact with some of the plants in our garden?
In the Northwest, we maybe can find some examples where the phenology or the life cycle of organisms, like we definitely see it with lilacs when blooming, that tends to be a little bit earlier. A lot of the insect pests that we deal with, and even some of the diseases and weeds, will respond to the same type of environmental cues. So if things are warmer in the spring, activity might start earlier in the season. And if you're a pest like an aphid who can have a high reproductive rate, you might be able to kick over more generations for that year, which will just be more individuals feeding on a plant. But it's hard to come up with a general rule about or a general trend about the effect of small changes in average temperatures per year or whatnot. We probably see climatic impacts in other ways, which then more exacerbate pest problems.
So, could those temperature changes affect how, say, introduced species thrive or don't thrive versus native species?
All species will kind of respond the way they respond normally to environmental changes. So I don't know if pests really get an upper hand in how things are changing in the environment, except remember that often we one of the key characters of being a pest is love and disturbance. And so if these climatic changes are causing disturbances out in the environment, that's where I think we do see the secondary effect of pest problems and exacerbating some of the changes in climate.
So, what about like milder winters? Is that kind of the same ideas apply, or are you going to see less die off because of the harder freezes, or more die off because we're getting more extreme cold?
No, and yeah, especially speaking in the insect world, they're pretty resilient in that regard. So I don't know if mild winters really impact. Again, it's hard to come up with a general rule. Whether like a mild winter will have cause a pest year or not. Because also remember, there's a lot of living things out there that like to eat pests, and so they're also responding usually in a positive way to warmer temperatures or better growing conditions.
Okay.
So so I don't know if those direct relationships really are showing themselves as key aspects to climate change. But I can tell you that the effect of changing rainfall patterns here in the Pacific Northwest is stressing plants out, especially perennial plants like trees and shrubs. And then that's creating a disturbance. That's the pest jam. That's what they like. They like a bunch of stressed out hosts that then they can go in and exploit. And so we are seeing that type of response. And we do have one specific example that's unfolding here in Washington state that's really unique, really modeling the effect of climate changes and the effect on tree health and then pests responding to that.
So, what might some of those examples be?
This one is a great example. It's a beetle that I found with Glenn Kohler, who's with Washington State Department of Natural Resources, and Jenny Senna, who's with the Washington Department of Agriculture, back in 2000. And that's what I get excited about. So you're going to have to cut me off if I go too long on it. but it's such a great example of what I think's going to happen as our environment changes here in the Pacific Northwest. But back in 2010, we found a brand new beetle in Washington state that we've never recorded since Europeans have settled here and collected bark beetles. And so this beetle was never known to occur in Washington state, and it's called the California five-spined Ips beetle. And its native range goes all the way through California and up into Oregon. It does kind of peter out, around Portland. We found it in the Columbia River Gorge by, kind of on the Hood River side of the Columbia River and White Salmon area. And then that beetle started to outbreak and killed a lot of trees within the Columbia River Gorge. A few environmental factors really contributed to that outbreak, but it really settled here in the state and started to spread northern and westward things kind of slowed down in the Columbia River Gorge, but it's a really big deal to find a brand new bark beetle in a territory that it's never occurred before. So the initial thought is that, well, things are getting warmer and maybe this beetle just expanded its range because of temperature. But what we really think's happening is the climatic models that predicted changes in climate patterns like rainfall are starting to fulfill what the predictive models show, where we actually get more rain annually or can get more rain annually, but when it comes, it all comes in the winter. And then we have long periods of dryness or drought periods during the growing season. And that's stressing out trees. And so this beetle, we think, is possibly going into a new range because the trees are vulnerable to attack and stressed out. And so that's kind of the secondary response to a change in climate where it impacts their food source and they're taking advantage of it.
What is the primary target of this particular bark beetle?
This bark beetle, its primary host here in the Northwest is ponderosa pines, but
Okay.
it's really changed a little bit on how it interacts with pine species. And we're seeing an outbreak here in Western Washington on other types of pine trees. Dr. Henry Adams with Washington State University and has a graduate student, Savannah, who's studying the tree's ability to create a defensive response. Traditionally, with bark beetles, it's usually producing pitch, and there's some morphological and genetic aspects of a tree that can show whether it can produce pitch or not. But what we think is this change in stress patterns that trees are experiencing are have reduced its ability to produce pitch, which then reduces its ability to ward off and defend itself against coordinated bark beetle attacks. And
Wow.
and so so that's the impact that the changing climate is having and is really a tree health issue.
But we haven't seen it spilling more eastward into eastern Washington. Is that because they're not as stressed, maybe that the bark beetle's not heading into eastern Washington?
We did see eastern movement into eastern Washington, and so it's up north past Moses Lake. I
Oh.
think we've gotten beetles out towards Walla Walla, so it is creeping closer and closer to some significant pine forests, and we don't know what to expect. If it'll behave where it can start causing problems in some of the eastern Washington forests also. It's still causing problems down on the eastern slopes of the Cascades, especially as you go south towards the Columbia River Gorge.
You mentioned a little bit about additional generations of certain species like aphids. Aside from, I mean, aphids are just about every gardener's enemy, but uh, what kind of, other than having potentially more aphids, what other changes or problems might we see from additional life cycles within a season?
Just additional life cycles means that there's literally more mouths to take bites out of plants or suck plant juices. So that just adds more feeding opportunity for those insect pests to feed on foliage or chew on bark or whatever, whatever pest. So a prolonged growing season that allows for an additional generation or half a generation just exposes plants to more feeding pressure.
Okay. So, what are some other pests that would be able to take advantage of that additional time for another life cycle aside from aphids?
It's really tough to say because we've been in I think these prolonged droughty periods for a while now, but there's not many insect models where we're documenting those specific changes that at least I'm aware of. I know in some of our agricultural settings, those numbers games, pests like aphids, whiteflies, psyllids, things like that that are have high reproduction and don't follow a strict phenology model of like we only have one generation a year or one and a half generations a year. I think those pests are adding to the feeding pressure that farmers have to deal with. But for gardeners, I'd say aphids are probably our number one issue of having potential of having more mouths that are going to be out there feeding on plants per year.
Okay. Do we know if the beneficial insects or the natural predatory insects are keeping pace with some of these other insects?
That's a great question. And going back to those life strategies, the things that like to eat pests generally follow a strategy of high competition. So they don't produce as many, they don't play the numbers game like pests do. So their response to their environment is almost is environmentally regulated, but also their ability to utilize their food resource. So often those populations do lag behind pest populations, and that's why we can see pest outbreaks. It's because they don't respond the same way that pests do to their environment. So it's hard to say just as a general rule, that's how natural enemies of pests are responding, but I expect that that's likely what's happening out there. So that doesn't mean that they aren't having a significant effect on reducing populations and maintaining a level of natural control, but they respond in a different way to their environment than pests do because they're not necessarily just relying on sheer numbers.
So we talked a little bit about drier summers and how the stress is making them more susceptible to attack. How might wetter springs, when you've got a damper or longer wet season in the spring, how might that affect the life cycle of some of these pests?
Another great one to see, and you'll be able to see this across the state, are birch trees and the decline of birch trees. And that one is also similar to what I described with the California five spine ips, where the trees are negatively responding to rainfall patterns. And so birch trees like it really wet, they like shade, and where we plant them and the varieties that we're planting just aren't performing well the way our rainfall patterns unfolding. So a good example is that those wet winters and kind of damp springs. Actually, damp springs are a little bit rarer than they used to be. So the trees' roots aren't driving deep because they've enjoyed like a nice wet surface. Now they may not be as deep as they could be, and so they're really susceptible for those drier periods. We'll see that with cedar trees too. Some of the cedar dieback that's happening. But birch trees are really unfortunate because we just finished August and now September. If you're driving around any urban areas in Washington State, you'll see a lot of dead and dying birch trees because their inability to navigate these dry periods. And then we have another wood-boring beetle, the bronze birch borer, that's coming in and really just taking advantage of those stressed out trees. So this is a native beetle that's just finding more opportunity and more things to feed on because we've introduced European species of birch, and some of our native birch are stressed out too. And so it's just taking advantage of those sick trees and kind of increasing their populations because of it.
So that just made me think of something that kind of goes back to what you're saying about what is a pest, and this native beetle that's starting to take out these birch trees. I think sometimes we have the mindset that it's only introduced species that can be pests in the plant world, whereas natives shouldn't be excluded from that list.
No, both these beetles are native at least to the western U.S., and we're just providing them a smorgasbord for them to take advantage of.
Do you have some tips for gardeners as far as monitoring and keeping track of seasonal shifts and sightings of insects?
Time will tell on how best to recommend, and there's probably better expertise out there to really look at your plant community compositions in your yards and what's going to perform well in the future as things kind of dry out in the summer, but look at those plants that are really struggling with, like, if you have birch trees, if don't plant more birch trees because of it. So to look at other types of tree species that will perform better and still serve that kind of function that you need in your yard. And we need trees out there, so serve in that landscape level function too. And so I just pay attention on who's doing good in your yard, and if they aren't doing good, reconsider what you replant with, and swap those plants or trees out.
And it just also makes me think about, I know a lot of gardeners like to keep journals of what they do in their garden every year. And this, looking back at that, could be a good way to see any trends in, what insects you're seeing in the garden, or, what plants are struggling. I know I started a journal, I don't know how many times, but never seem to be able to keep up with it for more than a couple of months at a time.
Journaling is a great way, and there are some places where, as especially for master gardeners and other really enthusiastic gardeners, is to participate and help researchers collect data on, like flowering times of lilac. And so over time we get better data sets of really what the changes, the climate changes are having on some of the plants and other pests out there. So look for those opportunities to help contribute. And I think journaling is a great way to really create a record of what you're seeing out there, and share that with the future generations.
Yeah. And there are a lot of citizen science programs on like iNaturalist or the National Phenology Network.
Yeah.
They maintain really good databases, and they use all that data to inform how these changes are affecting insect patterns and growth patterns and all kinds of things.
Yeah, iNaturalist is probably going to be such an invaluable resource as we get more and more people participating.
So, do you have some suggestions for some management strategy when it comes to pest stress on woody trees and shrubs?
For really trees and shrubs that have significant meaning to you, it is worth getting an arborist and coming out and getting health recommendations. It's a real slow dance of really managing babying those long-lived perennial plants in a situation where, like, do you irrigate them more? And if you do, that actually does kind of make them less resilient over time for droughty conditions, because you really do want to drive roots down to where the water is. And so it is a balance on how much you want to baby those weaker or more vulnerable plants in your yard through this changing climate, and gauging that with, once you commit to babying it, you're probably going to have to baby it for the rest of your life, and who knows who's going to be taking care of that plant the next round. So it's tough to come up with good recommendations, but focusing on soil health, the soil's ability to maintain moisture during these drought times, is a great tool. Like, good composting habits is probably one of the more useful things that you could do as a gardener for your yard, and really focus on that soil health and its ability to hold on to water and provide for plants.
I guess it's a good thing we just finished a whole series on soil health.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that'll be fresh in everybody's mind. They'll know
Yeah,
what to
good.
do. So, what kind of trends do you think gardeners should keep an eye out for when it comes to pests in their gardens, and how to adapt as a gardener to those changes? Well, aside, you said, like from what you said, when not overwatering so that the roots can get down, but
Yeah. With these types of literally global issues, it's almost best to pull your eyes out of just your yard and pay attention to what's happening in your communities, in your forests close by. Those are the ones that really give you an idea of how stressed things are or not stressed they are. And use that as a good indication of how you should prepare for or what you need to do for your yard. But I always think it's really useful to pay attention to, how those, especially perennials look in parks, out in the native forests, and how they look and emulate those those conditions that where things are looking pretty good, or and avoid those conditions where things aren't looking that great.
Comes to mind, if you're looking at a park, make sure it's a park that's not necessarily irrigated.
Right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Or if it is irrigated, make sure that you know that, and that's what you're gonna plan on emulating,
Right.
and then you're in it for the long haul. But these types of changes that we're experiencing are, region-wide landscape level changes, and it's gonna be more than trying to just fend for what our yards look like, because our yards are just going to respond much like the surrounding environment's going to respond. And there's only so much you have control over.
Right. So, why would changes in climate make some species more pestiferous?
Changes in climate, again, will affect pests directly as their biology responds to the environment. So, much like plants grow, insects grow at a rate of their environment and collect degree days just like plants do, and so they need to accumulate so many temperature units before they can grow through their life cycle. So things are warmer earlier, or are accumulate or happening or accumulating faster, they'll respond that way. But just like we saw in the trees, we'll also see this in our annual plants too, is really just the stress that the dry periods have if we're not providing some supplemental moisture during those dry periods. And when you got weak plants, they're sitting ducks for pests. And so some years will be good for certain pests that respond well to conditions, and then other years might find a different weather pattern that they respond to differently, and they're all going to be responding to the quality and the vulnerability of the plants that they're feeding on.
Can we expect long term to see species, like you said, with the bark beetle that was only seen in Oregon? Should we expect to see more of that over the coming years? That slowly some of these insects are going to migrate further north?
I do think so. I think we'll see a more beneficial condition for pests that don't normally like living in Washington State, now finding it a pretty great place to live in. My biggest concern, though, is the amount of new pests that our state gets and our region gets is unusual because of just our international trade practices now, and our location and our diverse climates that we have here in Washington State. When you combine that with a bunch of stressed out trees and food sources, new introductions of pests might establish a lot easier and faster here in the Pacific Northwest than they would have in the past. And so that's my biggest concern, is that we might be inadvertently creating a perfect condition for new pests to come in here and be quite successful because our plants are so stressed out.
I could see how that would be. It could be a big problem if you get these, say, Asia, or climates that are a bit warmer than we are, that or have been, that are coming in, and we now have a climate that is better suited to their needs.
Right. Yeah. And easy food for them to eat.
Right. So, anything else that you'd like to add about how climate change might be affecting pests in the garden?
Resilience is a tricky word because it can mean a lot in different situations. But I think resilience in context of changing climates is being able to adapt to the change. Of course, we'd like to adopt practices that might slow down or mitigate some of the changing climates, and hopefully we do those types of practices at some point, as kind of on a global scale. But in the meantime, I think we got to be really adaptive and pay attention and recognize stress in our plants as it happens. One of the neatest things about the Northwest, especially in Western Washington, Puget Sound area, you could just stick a plant in the ground and that's about all you have to do, and you call yourself a gardener because it's such a pleasant growing condition out here. And I think gardeners, are going to have to just pay attention more towards, recognizing plant stress and addressing stressors than we've had to in the past.
Yeah, I think, and I can see microclimates can come into that too. So, whereas before maybe you would, plant something right next to your house, maybe you'd want it in a, little further away from a heat sink like a house would be if it's exposed to the sun because it's already going to get plenty of heat
Right.
on its own.
But in some aspects, there's some things that you can enjoy with that. Tomatoes have always been a struggle for Western Washington, but
Yeah.
now you can grow some good tomatoes.
I don't know. It's not been a great tomato year for us this year.
Oh, no.
But all right. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that, those main points are when I first was introduced to this California five-spine Ips issue, my brain instantly went to, it's a warming climate, and this beetle is just responding by being able to live in a larger range. But understanding how these beetles interact with the actual health of their hosts, that's really helped me readjust my perception of what I'm seeing and pay attention to recognizing tree stress and plant stress as the real issue to navigate, because it's the susceptible hosts that are allowing these pests really to take advantage of new food that they couldn't take advantage of before. So this is the disturbance that they've been waiting for, and this is what they're made for exploiting. And so I think it's really important to understand that it's the plant stress that pests are responding to, not directly the warmer temperatures or so forth.
It's a secondary consequence of
Yeah.
the warming. I think that wraps it up. Thanks for joining me today, Todd.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and hope this was useful. And anytime anybody wants to reach out and have debates or arguments or want more information, they can contact me anytime.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Evergreen Thumb, brought to you by the WSU Extension Master Gardener Program volunteers and sponsored by the Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State. We hope that today's discussion has inspired and equipped you with valuable insights to nurture your garden. The Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State is a nonprofit organization whose primary purpose is to provide unifying support and advocacy for WSU Extension Master Gardener programs throughout Washington State. To support the Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State, visit www.mastergardenerfoundation.org/donate. Whether you're an experienced master gardener or just starting out, the WSU Extension Master Gardener Program is here to support you every step of the way. WSU Extension Master Gardeners empower and sustain diverse communities with relevant, unbiased, research-based horticulture education. Reach out to your local WSU Extension office to connect with master gardeners and tap into a wealth of resources that can help you achieve gardening success. To learn more about the program or how to become a master gardener, visit mastergardener.wsu.edu/get-involved. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected with us, be sure to subscribe to future episodes filled with expert tips, fascinating stories, and practical advice. Don't forget to leave a review and share it with fellow gardeners to spread the joy of gardening. Questions or comments to be addressed in future episodes can be sent to hello@theevergreenthumb.org. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by guests of this podcast are their own and do not imply endorsement by Washington State University or the Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State.